The bank definitely sees that higher inflation is on the horizon, which would tend to make them want to hike the rate. But our economy is also faring poorly. We have seen an increase in unemployment.
Every 40% of Canadians come home at the end of the month and go, if I didn't have this $200 that I had in my balance sheet right now, I would be facing bankruptcy. Is that what we're talking about?
The Bank of Canada does not want Canadians borrowing any more money. This is the conclusion drawn from the Canadian Survey of Consumer Expectations and the Business Outlook.
Canada is teetering on the brink of a financial breakdown as the Bank of Canada delivers a revelation most Canadians have been trying hard to avoid. With households buried in debt, consumer confidence falling fast, and the bank's inflation-fighting approach pushing the public to the limit, the economy is starting to split apart at the seams. The reality is likely even worse than most people imagine. As government spending and higher interest rates drive more Canadians toward insolvency, the bank's latest actions could be the tipping point for a middle class already in decline.
People feel. So whether or not they're going home and actually doing the math, they're feeling that at the end of every month, they're $200 away from being insolvent, meaning that they cannot pay their debts in an ordinary fashion, or that their assets are less than their liabilities. It's just a state of financial being. It's defined in our legislation. So what they are feeling is that if they had less than $200 every month, they may be insolvent and they may be.
Let's begin with the figure that should alarm every Canadian. 40% of the population, nearly 16 million people, have less than $200 left at the end of each month. $200, that is not savings. That is not a buffer. That is the narrow gap between staying afloat and total financial collapse. One car repair, one medical expense, even one broken appliance, and millions of Canadians are pushed over the edge. And the people in charge know it. They've reviewed the surveys, they've studied the numbers, they're choosing their language with extreme caution because they understand that if they reveal the full truth, the panic could speed up the very crisis they're trying to hold back.
Came out at the end of the year were extremely weak, and that would tend to make the bank want to cut rates. So it's being pulled in both directions, and the governor has signaled that interest rates are not the policy tool to deal with the issues that the Canadian
Bank of Canada is playing an information game, and Canadians are the ones paying the price. They release the figures that fit the narrative they want to promote. They emphasize the data that keeps people calm enough to continue spending, continue borrowing, and continue functioning.
Added a new layer of uncertainty. Its impact on the global and Canadian economies will depend on how long the conflict lasts and the extent to which it spreads across the Middle East.
The bank admits the war in Iran is going to push inflation up thanks to higher oil prices. Cheaper gas over the past few years has been a core driver behind the substantial drop in inflation that we've seen, which has gotten right at the 2% range that the Bank of Canada wants.
But here's what they don't put in the headlines. Consumer insolvencies surpassed 137,000 filings in 2024 alone. That is not just a number. That represents 137,000 families, businesses, and individuals who reached the end of the line. And that total is still rising. The bank knows the financial system is under intense pressure. What they're managing is not only inflation, they're also managing your fear, because fear alone can bring down an economy faster than almost any policy mistake.
Who pays for this latest $50 billion orgy of spending by this costly Prime Minister? We know who won't pay. It won't be those with trust funds that protect their millions of inheritance like the Prime Minister, nor the billionaires that invite him to their private Caribbean islands. They'll hide their money. You know who will pay? You will pay. You, the welder or waitress who can't pay your mortgage because he's inflated the mortgage rates. You will pay because he carbon taxed your food and now you can't feed your kids.
Now let's talk about debt, because this is where Canada's problems move from serious to truly disastrous. The federal government is carrying $1.3 trillion in debt. Provincial governments add another $2.5 trillion on top of that. But here's the part that gets almost no attention. Canadian consumers are holding $2.6 trillion in personal debt.
Said something that most people in real estate will not repeat or say out loud.
What I would say about prices is, I think I said this at the last press conference, we need house prices.
Mortgages, credit cards, auto loans, lines of credit. Canada's household debt-to-income ratio is among the highest anywhere in the world. Canadian families are using 14 to 15 cents of every dollar they earn just to service debt they already have. Not to reduce it, not to grow savings, just to keep up with existing payments. That is an economy barely operating on fumes while the fuel tank is leaking from the bottom.
You expect to hear next hour from Tiff Macklem when he's asked about this decision.
He's going to point to all of the sources of uncertainty that we are seeing. There was already high uncertainty because of the tariff war that has been launched against Canada and most other countries in the world by the United States. And now the conflict in the Gulf region has heightened that uncertainty even more.
Then there's the crowding out effect. It is making everything worse in a way most people never hear about. When the government borrows on this scale, it eats up a massive share of the available credit in the economy. That credit does not go to small businesses trying to expand and hire. It does not go to young families trying to purchase their first home. It gets soaked up by government borrowing, which drives up the cost of credit for everyone else. The Bank of Canada's ability to cut rates and relieve pressure on consumers is being directly weakened by the government's own appetite for borrowing. It's like trying to empty water out of a sinking boat while someone else keeps drilling fresh holes in the hull.
Report the message it wants to send. Regardless, all of this recent data was gathered prior to the war. Fast forward, the bank did another follow-up, now finding about 81% of Canadians think inflation is heading higher on the war. And the bank's definitely not going to like that data, as it's actively trying to prevent Canadians from demanding wage increases to deal with these higher costs. Demanding wage increases to make up for their lost purchasing.
Speaking of interest rates, the mortgage renewal crisis ahead is something that keeps economists up at night. Hundreds of thousands of Canadians are locked into mortgages from the pandemic era at near zero rates. Those renewals are happening now, and the new rates are anything but mild. People who were paying $1,800 a month are suddenly facing $2,700 or $3,000 or even more. That is not a simple adjustment. That is a financial earthquake hitting millions of homes at the same time. The Bank of Canada knows perfectly well that cutting rates too quickly could reignite inflation, so they hold. And while they hold, homeowners are being crushed by payments they never expected on homes they can no longer comfortably afford. In a market where selling does not even guarantee a way out of the financial hole.
Is that businesses will pass on the higher cost of oil to consumers, who then demand wage increases to pay for those higher prices, and then businesses pass those costs on to consumers, creating a self-reinforcing loop. Recall back in 2022 when the governor warned business leaders not to build inflation into their wages, telling them don't build that into long-term contracts. Don't build that into wage contracts. So this data coming out of the consumer survey, which the bank was concerned enough about to go back for a third.
At the same time, the war-driven inflation surge changed everything for Canadian businesses almost overnight. Before the conflict disrupted global supply chains and commodity markets, business sentiment surveys showed cautious optimism. Employment was improving. Investment plans were rising. Then reality hit. Input costs jumped. Energy prices soared. And now businesses are preparing to raise prices not because they want to, but because they have no other choice. That sets off the scenario the Bank of Canada fears most of all: the wage price spiral. Workers see prices climbing and demand higher pay. Higher wages drive costs up even more. Businesses raise prices again, and the cycle keeps feeding itself until inflation becomes truly uncontrollable. Canada is standing at the doorway of that spiral right now.
Debt service ratios for consumers is around 14%. About 14% of disposable income in Canada goes towards debt service. The commensurate number in the United States is about 11%. So 11% versus 14%. Can you explain why it's higher in Canada than it is in the United States?
Cost of living may be a part of that. Could be relative to interest rates and inflation. I haven't really studied that to answer that with any sort of certainty.
Okay, so our cost of servicing debt in Canada is 3% higher. About half of that is mortgage debt and half of that is consumer debt of some sort, whether it's autos or credit cards. And yet the Bank of Canada rate is 2.25% versus about 150 basis points higher in the United States. So United States banks charge more interest and yet the United States consumer pays.
Here is the real story buried underneath the numbers. More than 2 million Canadians are using food banks. 2 million people in one of the wealthiest countries on earth, with some of the most fertile agricultural land in the world, and millions still cannot reliably feed themselves. And because using a food bank carries a stigma many people cannot bear, millions more are turning to credit cards charging 22 to 24% interest just to buy groceries. They are taking on high-interest debt simply to purchase food. This is not the story of a developing economy. This is Canada in 2026, and it is harsh, it is real, and it is getting worse rather than better.
Are way too expensive, and they need to find a way to bring them down. Interest rates alone is not going to fix this. As the interest rates may come down or it may go up, but even if they come down, it's not going to fix this problem here anymore. So what actually needs to happen to fix this problem? Well, the easy thing to say is the prices need to come down, which is what pretty much they're targeting, or your actual income needs to go up, which I really don't see a way of this happening in our economy.
The housing market deserves its own brutal review. The government introduced GST cuts on new construction and other incentives for first-time buyers in an effort to stimulate building and lower prices. On paper, that sounds fairly reasonable. In practice, the situation is much more complicated. As tax incentives and increased supply push new home prices lower, resale home values come down as well. For a first-time buyer entering the market, that may be good news. But for millions of Canadians whose main financial asset, often their only meaningful asset, is their home, falling values mean shrinking net worth at the exact same time mortgage costs are rising. So they are being hit from both sides at once, with no relief coming from either the government or the central bank.
Watching their cost of living climb while depending on credit cards to survive.
Consumer credit card debt hit $122 billion this year in Q2, the highest it's been since 2007. According to Equifax, it's millennials and younger Canadians who are having the hardest time.
Pandemic-era quantitative easing program left another dangerous landmine in Canada's financial system. The Bank of Canada purchased enormous amounts of bonds and corporate assets to keep the economy alive during the shutdowns. In the short term, it worked, but the long-term result is a balance sheet filled with assets now worth far less than what was paid for them, with losses that will not be recovered until 2030 at the earliest.
At least the central bank is releasing these surveys letting us know that for now, they do not want us borrowing and spending, letting us know that
the bank has now moved into quantitative tightening, allowing those assets to mature instead of replacing them. That pulls money out of the economy. It is the financial equivalent of slowly releasing pressure from a system, except the system is already fractured, and the people relying on accessible credit are feeling that pressure vanish while their costs continue climbing.
Data coming out of the consumer survey, which the bank was concerned enough about to go back for a third follow-up, showing a consumer that is expecting inflation as this goes on, is definitely not what the bank wants to see. So on that survey of consumer expectations, we 1, have a bank that's not going to like what it sees, 2, wants us to know that it doesn't like what it sees and has chosen to release that data, and 3, wants us to know that things were.
The Bank of Canada's communication strategy has come under serious criticism, and that criticism is entirely warranted. Central banks have always used messaging as a policy tool. What the bank is doing now crosses into territory that feels less like honest economic communication and more like narrative management. When 81% of Canadians already believe inflation will rise because of global instability, and the bank's own data shows households hanging on by a thread, releasing selective survey results to shape expectations is not transparency. Canadians are being asked to sit in the crowd and applaud while the curtain hides the real crisis unfolding behind the stage.
The Bank of Canada lowers the interest rate. The 5-year rate doesn't seem to respond, so the mortgage rate is still elevated compared to the bank rate. So that indicates there's a crowding out in debt markets, and the big actor in debt markets continues to be the government. Can you see that maybe if the government wasn't taking as much debt space, that there would be lower rates of...
What makes this entire situation especially dangerous is how tightly connected every pressure point is. Consumer debt leads to insolvency filings. Insolvencies weaken the financial sector. Government debt crowds out private credit. Tighter credit slows business investment. Slower investment kills job growth, and fewer jobs lead to more mortgage defaults. Mortgage defaults cool an already unstable housing market, so every problem is linked to every other problem. Solving one while ignoring the rest is like putting a bandage over a wound that needs surgery. The government is handing out bandages, the Bank of Canada is managing appearances, and the Canadian public is carrying the real cost of decisions made at levels of power most people will never reach.
In the last handful of years, we're up to, at the federal level, $1.3 trillion in debt. When you include the provincial debt, we're at $2.5 trillion and an extra $2.6 trillion of consumer debt on top of that. With the mounting debt in Canada, primarily from governments, do you see potentially a crowding out of debt available for consumer means and as a result higher interest?